Good afternoon, I'm Emily Cass. I'm the chapter president for the Chesapeake chapter, and I wanted to welcome all of you to our webinar today on transportation, land use, and TDM. A few housekeeping items. All attendees will be placed on mute during the presentation, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A session where you can definitely unmute yourself if you do have a question. This webinar will be recorded and should be available on our webpage in the next few days, just in case you have to get off or something has come up, you'll be able to see it again. First, let me just go ahead and introduce our speaker today. It is Dr. Erdogan is an assistant research professor and director of the Transportation Policy Research Group at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education in the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation at the University of Maryland. Her research focuses on developing methods, models, and tools to inform policy and decision-making on the interrelations among human infrastructure, socioeconomic activity, and the environment. Her expertise includes network modeling and optimization, travel demand management with emphasis on pricing and energy-efficient transportation alternatives, dynamic travel behavior, alternate fuel vehicles and fleet operations, emerging transportation technologies, integrated land use and transportation planning, transportation policy, urban growth, and environment. She's received her PhD in civil engineering at the University of Maryland, specializing in transportation. She's received her MS degrees in operations research from the University of Delaware and in civil engineering from Istanbul Technical University, and a BS degree in geomatics engineering from Istanbul Technical University. So welcome, and Dr. Erdogan, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity for speaking with you all about transportation and land use. So I will start. Let me see. Today we'll talk about, I'll start with a brief introduction of the center and what kind of work we do and some examples. And later on, and after that, I will, start with a kind of big picture conceptual framework of transportation system analysis, and then TDM, and then how we'll talk about integration, the integrated land use and transportation, and how the demand management relates to these two relationships. And then I will give you an example of a study we did for Maryland Transportation, Department of Transportation a while ago, and then I thought there's a good, it presents as a good example. So NCSG, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but it has been founded in year 2000 at the University of Maryland as an interdisciplinary multi-school and cooperative venture. So we are affiliated with 4 schools in the University of Maryland: School of Architecture, Agricultural and Natural Resources, Engineering and Public Policy. But we are mainly housed in urban planning, and we have new relationships with School of Public Health and also iSchool, the information school. And then we basically do research on land use, transportation, environment, public health, housing and community development, and to some extent international urban development. And for more information, you can visit our website, which is always behind, but I hope it will give you an example. So these are some of our current and upcoming research, and I didn't include everything, but the things that I am kind of working closely or familiar with. Transportation Policy Research Group at the NCSG is a kind of subgroup built with a cooperative agreement with the Maryland Department of Transportation. So through this agreement, we do some transportation policy research for the department. So every year we identify some projects or scope to work, to kind of help them, help the state. So this year we are working on, or since last year actually, we have been working on 2 projects. One of them is kind of looking into closing the commuter rail gap between Mark and SEPTA. using the Federal Transit Administration STOPS model. And the other project involves looking at the health impacts of transportation projects. Two projects we selected, or we agreed on, are the Purple Line corridor and the Capitol Crescent Trail. Impacts of these two projects on health, and we are using a model called ITEM, Integrated Transportation Health Impact Model, and we are currently in the kind of beginning stage of a travel behavior survey. We're conducting we'll be conducting a survey to understand the effects of COVID-19 on travel behavior. And some other projects, initiatives, I don't want to kind of spend too much time. We have been working on developing a mode choice model to be able to analyze the impacts of complete streets. This is a sort of new and exciting project because there is almost no modeling work that is capable of doing this kind of analysis. And we have been working on a kind of internal seed grant. I'm not sure if you're aware of, there is a Maryland Transportation Institute established, I think, about a year or so ago at University of Maryland, bringing together all the transportation-related researchers and the efforts. So we started we are going to start two initiatives through that effort. One will be about transportation and equity, and the other one will be transportation assistance clinics, so to kind of help local governments and agencies some transportation-related technical help. And as you may know, we have a large Purple Line transit-oriented development grant and some smart city-related research. And some upcoming research are about, from NSF, and we'll be working with the Prince George's County, hopefully it's still in the workings, and there are some other. So with that, I'll start our today's after in the quick Q&A or later on, if you have any other questions or need more details, please reach out to me. I typically, this may be old or outdated, but I typically start speaking about this kind of big picture transportation system analysis fundamentals. I think it can be enhanced for today's conditions, but I think it still is fundamental to understand these relationships. So basically, transportation system, there are three big components, right? Transportation system, activity system, and through the interactions of these two systems, the flows on the roads and transportation system performance. So activity system, as you know, the job locations, housing, and the things we do in our social life, right? We go from A to B and so on. And basically our social-economic system forms the activity system. And transportation system, as you know, the roads and the infrastructure networks represents the transportation system. And through the interaction of activity system on the networks, we get the traffic flows and volumes on the roads, and then this builds a supply and demand relationship. As the demand for our transportation system flows increase, we measure performance. We always talk about delays and congestion, and we need to do something about this. And then the two relationships, like numbered by 2 and 3. One is, through the accessibilities, as accessibility is affected by the congestion or gets difficult, or certain modes are not available to access to certain places. So people may decide to move around or switch the modes. Or on the other hand, on the transportation system, government and private companies may choose to provide new services, new roads, or other, as you know, the transportation demand related policies and so on. So related to this, for instance, Induced demand, it can be a controversial topic and so on, but related to this, providing or related to this relationship tree, providing services to respond to the system demand and performance. And typical approach used to be, right, when there is congestion, when the capacity is not able to meet demand, we go for maybe adding lanes or providing new capacity and so on. In this figure, it's very simple, just to explain conceptually, I think. So the horizontal axis kind of represents time. In time, traffic flow, as you know, continues increasing. We do, transportation planning or forecast, and we know that the forecast shows that, the capacity will not be enough in the future, and then we may decide to add more lanes, build more capacity, like road widening. That kind of allows more supply, then flows increase on those roadways, widened, but there is also, some of it are absorbed by the increased flow, like forecast flow is used by those demand, but some of it is, we call it the development induced demand. It may, not only some of this traffic may come from, because the travel is easier on some road, and as people choose to take that road, but also because it's travel is easier, people may choose to live in close by that facility, or developers may choose to develop because there is now access to that location and so on. So the induced demand, the idea is providing more capacity is not always a good idea to deal with congestion or the poor performance of the road facilities. So that brings us to the travel demand management idea. So this is the Federal Highways definition, an operational philosophy that seeks a holistic approach to urban transportation, one that better balances demand and supply solutions, and seeks for better to use the existing capacity better and a more sustainable way. So in this figure, the Federal Highway, or and it is I think it describes pretty well. We look at it as in 3 stages. The color purple, or we care more about, at least in today's presentation, I think we will say, in the first stage, travel demand. We need to, I think, distinguish travel demand here, traffic demand, and network demand. This stage deals with the choices that travel before the travel, right? Whether to travel, which mode to travel, what time to travel, and so on. This is before travel happens. So when we talk about travel demand management, I think the most sustainable way is to reduce or need for that travel, right? So the choices could be, destinations, and also, is it better to travel to a farther destination or a closer destination to reduce our impact on the transportation system? That is a shorter one. So for some strategies, as we know, like telecommuting, e-commerce, maybe so basically these are the policies or methods to affect the travel choices. So pricing could be one of them, and so on. So after, let's say, and another way to deal with this is to at least reduce the demand by driving along. Once the travel decision is made and destination is chosen, then the choice comes to the traffic demand. So that comes to the once we are on the road, then we can try to influence which roads to take, which mode to use, and so on. And then after that, the third stage is the lane choice and, the network demand and the route choice and time choice. And the third one is once we are on the route, when we choose a route and mode and so on, this is not very, our lane choice can be influenced by, again, maybe pricing, maybe, information, like variable message signs, or like we see in the works on examples, right? So we were maybe directed to use certain lanes and so on certain times. So this brings us to a balanced approach to transportation planning. So starting from the fundamentals, as we talked about, the conventional approach to, dealing with congestion was more about, the way I see it is dealing with the symptoms rather than, the source of the kind of problem. So there is congestion because people, live in certain places, work in certain places, and they need, we put those travels onto the network, and network starts getting congested, and then we say, then we need to build more lanes or more roads, or we need to manage it more efficiently by using maybe system management methods or ITS and so on. So this, vertical line conventional approach kind of focuses on moving more cars rather than moving people. But the balanced approach, looks at the problem in more diverse and more balanced way. Instead of focusing on moving cars, we can focus on moving people, right? Looking into transit options, non-motorized options, providing, basically we try to provide alternatives to kind of use the system as efficient as possible, and without building more capacity. And perhaps using pricing mechanisms or market mechanisms, and improve, looking at the quality of travel, for instance, like context-sensitive design or complete streets, how that affects people's travel choices, and different, the traffic calming. If, for instance, security and safety is an issue in choosing transit modes, we could, try to do something about that. And moving fewer people, fewer miles, that goes into the travel demand, or the affecting the choice, influencing the choices before the travel actually happens. That goes into land, looking at the land use development or land use policies, road network development, again, some market options like pricing, and different, telecommuting and e-commerce. So how land use and transportation relationship plays into this. If we look at this feedback cycle, so we start from the activities. We said that, if you remember the first figure, we have a socioeconomic system, right? We do some activities. Travel is a derived demand, right? We do it for, well, sometimes for the sake of it, potentially, but most of the time, we need to get from place to place to do some activities. And those choices and effects are also other transportation related choices, right? Car ownership, decisions that are related to, trip decisions and destination choices, mode choices, route choice, link, and then all these decisions kind of culminates into the traffic volumes on the roadways. And then this kind of presents itself as accessibility, which is transportation land use, what connects actually transportation and land use. Accessibility measure then kind of identifies or determines the attractiveness of locations, right? If if it is difficult to access to some place, then potentially your location decisions will be affected by that measure, right? If there is a good access to a location, like for instance, you all see in the kind of house ads and so on, like, oh, by the freeway, or very easy access to I-95, things like that. So that affects our location decisions too, right? When you buy a house, or when you probably don't have much flexibility choosing your workplace, but to some extent you can. And then developers also make these decisions based on accessibilities, and the constructions happen, and location decisions happen, people move around, and this cycle of transportation and land use, supply and demand kind of feeds from each other. And we know that it is not easy to influence these decisions. We are dealing with government. We are dealing with human behavior, human nature, and as you know, we are dealing with an existing infrastructure which is not very flexible, rigid, both transportation and land use. It's not like something you can, change overnight. It takes, it is difficult. So one of the barriers and challenges in, using policies and measures to influence travel demand using both land use and changing transportation policies is rigid transportation infrastructure. We have a transportation infrastructure. Changing it is not easy, and changing towards a different way of doing things is also not easy. So we need to work with what we have. And spread out built environment is another thing, that we have also certain cities, or developed in certain ways. How do we work with this environment? And also we have our economy is kind of automobile is mostly subsidized, and as a resulting social culture, right? The automobility is most of the time comes down to like the cheapest and easiest options. How do we change that, or how do we work with when competing with automobile is difficult? So, and then challenges to face, as I said, changing travel behavior and culture, and overcoming the barriers of this built environment, urban, suburban, exurban geography. But there's still it is important to identify opportunities within the given system and finding the right combination of alternatives and options. So without going into detail, for instance, one can look at these policies and options from like supply side, demand side. Sometimes they are very interrelated. It's hard to kind of put them in boxes. So I'm not going to go through, but to give you an idea. And there can be regulatory options and the primarily market-oriented options. And so I'm not going to go through all these things, but you can take a look later. Basically, supply side, building more roads, expanding, improving highway maintenance, adding like traffic management centers, ITS, and so on, goes into the supply side, and regulatory options. On the demand side, we will focus on today the land use policies and how they interact the transportation. As we talked about at the beginning, and how the land is arranged affects how we travel significantly. For instance, how many and number of trips taken, length of the trips, the modes we choose, types of travel, and the cost of travel. All, land use affects these significantly. And look at how we organize, or how land use can be influenced so that these travel effects can be more beneficial or more sustainable. there are, in planning field like this, there are 5 Ds, and actually these are increasing as time goes. But like destinations, density, distance, diversity, design, and among these, the destinations is the one that kind of most significant from the regional perspective. So we'll focus on that, and so that relates to the land use more. And other Ds are distance to jobs, distance to transit, and so on. So on the regional side, some policies include creating boundaries for growth, right? Zoning and urban growth boundaries, and creating transit-oriented development areas, creating corridors, like retrofitting major urban arterials, pricing public infrastructure and services, and manipulating market. On the local side, the other 4 Ds like density, diversity, and distance, these are more on the design side, right? Changing the streetscape, making it more human scale, more walkable, more inviting, or creating places, improving street connectivity, and designing for density and amenity. Like when you create people who want to, streets can be locations, right, rather than just for travel purpose. As we talk about, we'll focus on a bit more destinations. As I said, travel is a derived demand for the most part, and accessibility is the key measure that influences transportation and land use relationship. And one of the key concepts or measure is jobs housing balance. If people are living in one place and working in another, so that kind of obviously increases our travel, right? But if you live close by your work, and if you have opportunity, as you see in these pictures, we typically build our cities segregated, right? The residential areas in one place, work or workplaces, office space is another, and we just have highways to go between them. So this is, in the long run, has the most important impact on the transportation. And zoning is the key measure that can be changed. This is like a classical picture showing the the urban sprawl. In the upper part, as you see in that neighborhood, the way it is designed, cul-de-sacs, and the school is in one place, apartments in one place, houses and mall in one place, and the only way to get from, let's say, houses to the mall or school is to get onto this main road. There is no, you cannot walk, there is no access, right? But on the other hand, in the tradition, bottom part, at least there are some connections. Connectivity is higher in this neighborhood. So one can potentially walk or bike or use other options. So this we see in many cities in the US, right? So ways to, how do we create boundaries or urban growth? There are 2 major ways: urban service boundary, which Maryland utilizes that, and urban growth boundaries. And I think one example is Portland. So the policies, Maryland Smart Growth, Maryland Smart Growth approach is priority funding areas. With that, the Maryland, identifies where public services, funded, and it's not forced, but then it provides an incentive, right? These are, try to push the development in certain areas by providing public services within some boundaries. Rural legacy areas, brownfield development, live near your work, and job creation tax credits are the kind of tools that Maryland has in has been using for the smart growth approach. And so these policies affect the density and destinations, of course, and encourage higher suburban densities. And the side effects could be higher land prices, but then we expect to reduce the number of trips due to the increased density and maybe shared on more alternative modes. And part of the way to do this also relaxing zoning regulations, allowing more, mixed development that could reduce the distances, because then you wouldn't have to, travel by car to shop, or everywhere by car, but you may have other options, or you may not even need to get onto a vehicle, and you might be able to walk to shopping and so on. And relaxing minimum parking requirements is another way of doing this. And another policy is transit-oriented development. So basically, it's, this is also supporting zoning regulations and incentives to increase the density around the transit stations. Maryland does this mostly on the rail stations. With this, transit use can be increased, but there are, of course, challenges. The transit still needs to be competitive with highway modes, and connectivity needs to be well connected, because if you have to make several transfers, if you still have to get to the station from where you are and so on, it may still not be as effective. And the employee programs may be also helpful to improve the success of TODs with flexible work hours, or transit use benefit packages and so on. And so the automobility cost, or the ease of ownership also can be effective, because if you have access to a car and it is so convenient for you to park and drive, and even if you have a nearby transit station, you may still choose to drive if it is much easier and cheaper for you. So there are these kind of challenges, but it is, yeah. So some other, other factors in the success of TODs is the land users needs to be conducive, and diversity of jobs, housing and jobs, and retail in close proximity is important, and complementary uses, right? To reduce the need for travel as much as possible. And typically a successful TOD is kind of, if it can contain internal trips, or 10 to 40% internal trips, that would be a good start. So now I would like to give an example from one of the projects we did for the Maryland Department of Transportation. This is a while ago, but I think it's still relevant. So in this project, we looked at the objective was to look at the transportation network and land use changes, and how they would affect travel behavior and system performance. And basically, this was an exercise for the state, that how the different land use and transportation changes, what kind of policy, for the policy guidance we used, just an exercise, scenario exercise. For this, we use an Maryland statewide transportation model. You may be familiar with the MPO transportation forecast models, or demand models, travel demand models. And this is a statewide version of that. So it is a multi-state. It includes Maryland transportation network, and parts, all the DC, Delaware, and parts of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia. So the model is also exogenously combined with a land use model, and econometric models. And the transportation policies and land use are exogenously input to the model. And I'll show you some examples. And we look at through this is a 4-step travel demand model. And basically, if you remember the TDM figure I showed you, sort of, it is also following the travel demand, 4-step travel demand choices, right? And idea is to affect those choices. So with this project, we looked into different transportation scenarios and land use scenarios and combination of those. How, because typically transportation travel demand models look at only transportation scenarios. We look at only, oh, okay, what would happen if I add this capacity, or if we build another connection between A and B, how the system performance happens, or we use the travel demand models to forecast future traffic conditions and network performance, right? We have a current year, we have a future year. Currently, it's when this study was done, current year was 2007 and future year was 2030. Currently, those years advanced to 2015 and 2040. Anyway, we look at, what will be the system, how the system will perform given the population and employment increases in the region. And with this project, we look at also, combination for this. I will focus on the transit improvements, which we reflected by reducing fare and reducing the headways. And also on the land use side, the baseline reflects the cooperative forecast. Basically, baseline or the land use inputs are population and employment distribution in the region. And through the different scenarios, we can change the distribution of population and employment, basically land use as well. In the transit-friendly development scenario, we strategically located households and employment growth to the priority transit areas and other transit areas. So we located a quarter of that growth into these transit-friendly development areas. And this shows the density changes or differences between the land use scenarios, and shows the current conditions in the 2007 with housing density and employment density. As we know, it's typically in the urban areas and metropolitan areas. Majority of the housing and employment is in the metropolitan areas of Baltimore and Washington. And this is the future population and employment distribution based on the cooperative forecasts. And the future scenarios also includes the future planned transportation infrastructure changes. For instance, it included Purple Line, ICC, and other toll roads and HOV lanes planned for the 2030. Again, this shows the land use changes for the transit-oriented development scenario, and these are, as you see, we change the growth along those TFD areas. So this is the kind of, we look at the combinations of all these scenarios and some results. We look at the VMT changes, both, the horizontal, if you look at the rows, those are the kind of the land use impacts. And if you look at vertically, those are both, and the comparisons are all, these percent changes from in the parentheses are showing the change from the baseline or CLRP conditions. I have some summaries now. It is hard to digest or look at this, but looking at, in general, we look at the influencing pricing or high energy price is the most effective scenario, looks like. And VHT also follows the VMT trend, but a little bit higher. So some highlights or land use alternatives from that, when we look at carefully to that output tables, high energy price scenario provides greatest reduction in VMT and VHT, which is typical performance measures when we look at highway performance. And when we look at the transit-friendly development or transit-oriented development, we provide reduction, but it is less than high energy prices. Partially because I think that travel demand is more sensitive to cost, and transit changes were kind of modest, although we had headway changes and so on, but still it's not as significant apparently. And then from the transportation alternatives, transit improvements is yielding moderate reductions. And again, express toll lanes increase VMT, but reduce VHT. Looking at the combination scenarios, again, the high energy price together with transit service improvements provides the greatest reduction. And if you look at transit-friendly development scenario a bit closer, and for these locations of the TOD areas are these red and yellow dots. So these are Maryland's TOD areas, basically rail stations. So as I said, we increased, or we put the growth into these areas, or around these station areas. And this is the kind of highway performance results we get. This is the highway link volumes, vehicles per day. As you see, there is in major, or some decreases, or at least we have some improvements in all major roadways in the region. Probably not very significant, but it's improvement. And we could look at the results from the how the scenario or how the policy affects mode share. As you see, we can look at also the mode share by purpose. We see that the major largest shifts in the modes we see for the rail service is expected, because it's our TODs were built around the rail stations, and we see declines in single occupancy vehicle but also high occupancy vehicles. So it affected driving in both modes. And we saw the largest decline for work trips or work purposes. But we see similar response from non-work and work travel. And we can look at the results or mode shifts by income groups as well, because our model kind of includes 5 income groups. And we see that transit share increase for all income groups, but less for low income groups. But we thought that could be due to maybe low income groups having limited options, so that they already may be transit captured, and there is not much room for improvement. And we see that again, SOV and HOV use reduces for all income groups, and more on the low and upper incomes. So some conclusions we had from this exercise was we saw reductions in the total trips, and we saw reductions in the average trip lengths. Transit share increased, modest, but still an increase. And we see that the rail share is higher. So while we reduce SOV mode share, we see reductions in HOV mode share too, which probably not a very desired impact, but but still we see the greatest decline in SOV trips. And from the transportation side, we see that transit origins are scattered, right? People coming from different, but destinations are concentrated because our employment, in the area we have employment centers. So to changes in the transit service, we see that work trips are more responsive, partially because these destinations are concentrated. As expected, rail is more responsive. Looking at the HOV, HOVs are used mostly for non-work trips and highest share for low-income trips, which is, an expected result. And express toll lanes helped relieving congestion, but it didn't help reducing travel. And partially in this area or in our exercise, we see that they don't really interact, or they serve for different markets in our area. We put the toll lanes on the beltways and the freeways, whereas the transit serves to the core of the area. And from the land use scenarios perspective, we saw that high energy price reduced total trips, short-term trips, and reduced single-purpose vehicle travel for all income groups. Transit-oriented development also was effective, but less so scenario. But it increased transit usage for up to 20%, almost all purposes and modes. Shortened trips and attractive as destination from non-TFT areas. So we also looked at the Baltimore and Washington regions separately, and we saw that although there were some differences, the response was more or less similar. So I think with that, so some lessons with TOD applications, maybe focusing on the work and or destinations of the trips would be more beneficial, and like concentrating workplaces and focusing on transit which operates faster and can compete with auto mode, right? Like exclusive guideway transit options, rail, busway, and BRT type of services. So with that, I want to, don't want to take more time from questions. Thank you so much.
Okay, does anybody have a question? Any questions? Marta, are you raising your hand? You're so good.
Thank you. Thanks, Sevgi. That was a really, really interesting presentation. One question that I have, well, I have two questions. The first, what was the time period of the study that you were referencing that was measuring the mode shift?
You mean, so as I mentioned, we used the Maryland statewide transportation model, and we looked at the future scenarios in 2030, year 2030. Do you mean like so?
Oh, okay. So they're predictions for the future.
Predictions, yes.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. And then the second question I had, could you describe high energy price again? I'm not super familiar with that concept and saw a lot of acronyms and.
I know. Sorry about that. So high energy price, basically, we reflected prices in the automobility cost and auto operating cost, basically fuel prices. So we increased the gas price, basically.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome, thank you.
You're welcome.
I saw Raymond raised his hand.
Yes, my question was answered. That was the same question I had. So my question did get answered. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, as you know, the models have limitations, and sometimes the parameters in the model allows you to do certain things. Also, to reflect the high energy prices, the parameter we played with was auto operating cost. Yeah.
So one of the things that you did talk about earlier in the presentation that kind of piqued my interest was the complete streets model.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know if you could elaborate on that a little bit more. And the reason I asked that is because, everybody in this region in particular is kind of moving toward, complete streets and what that brings as it relates to better interconnectability of mobility and congestion mitigation that it kind of asserts with it, right? So how is that being looked at? Because I think that also kind of ties into a lot of the form-based stuff that you were talking about in regards to zoning and.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because this is sort of new. We are working with the State Highway Administration on this project. And so we became sort of part of their modeling team. This project started with, we were kind of developing a new mode choice model, because current Maryland MPO models and at least the statewide model does not include non-motorized modes in it, right? So we only have motorized modes in this analysis. So all these results I showed, or all the Maryland statewide transportation model work, kind of takes out the non-motorized transportation at the beginning, and the rest of the model runs. And this is typical for all the travel demand models. But now there is a shift towards, as you said, all these policies or projects, and there is shift towards context-sensitive design or the complete streets, and the state is interested in how we can evaluate these projects, their impacts in the network, right? And the Maryland statewide transportation model is also in kind of under development, or there is a new version coming out, and we are trying to improve that version to be able to give this capability or analysis capability for the non-motorized modes of this kind of projects. So right now we are working to develop an stated preference survey to to develop elasticities, let's say, because it turned out that changing the mode choice model within this model will be very complicated or not desired. So we are trying to come up with a method to make the model sensitive to changes in biking and walking facilities, or and the stated preference survey, we are asking, we are using the level of traffic stress measure. Are you familiar with it? So
Yes.
Yeah, so I think Maryland Department of Transportation also in the process of developing a level of service LTS network, or I think that needs to be incorporated in the statewide model as well. Mm-hmm. And we are also inquiring or looking into I'm not sure if you are familiar, there is an accessibility observatory center at the University of Minnesota. It's a pooled fund research, and Maryland is a part of it. And so they have accessibility data for transit, walk, bike, I'm not sure, walk, bike at least. And we got that data. We are looking into that data, how we can utilize for this purpose. So there are non-motorized mode accessibilities. So basically, yeah, the idea is to making the statewide model sensitive to non-motorized travel, and developing a capability of analyzing complete street projects into this model. So yeah, we are still in the process. But once it is done, hopefully, statewide model and the state's intention is that having this statewide model is a tool for, local agencies or anyone, any jurisdiction that wants, because the new model is also developed in a 3-tier system. In the project example I showed you, it's one network. Now with the new version, they are developing 3-level. One is similar to this one, the highest level. Second level is the TAZ level, or the MPO or network level, and the third one will be like census block level, very detailed. So for that, they will, let's say you want to do a very focused analysis for a city or town center. We'll be able to ask for that portion of the network, not the whole statewide network, and focus on analysis only in that sub-area network. So these are
So
all.
it is establishing geography that kind of goes beyond boundaries.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, do you have any other? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was just asking if that answered or did that help.
It did. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other questions?
I do. I guess I have one more. I feel like I'm the only one asking questions. But one thing, well, first and foremost, thank you for your presentation. I think it was very knowledge-filled. Definitely gained something from it. One thing that I think counties, municipalities, cities, I think everybody's kind of struggling with is, we're talking about transportation, land use, and transportation demand management strategies, and it all kind of ties together. Mm-hmm. In the vein of like creating performance measures or performance metrics, right? So we all kind of govern ourselves with some type of performance measure, performance metric. It can't be managed if it can't be measured. Mm-hmm. And we have here in Anne Arundel County, we've kind of looked at our transportation demand management program and identify how we can establish a performance measure associated with that. And it's associated with the land use. And so what I guess the quick way to it is, we have development reviews that come in and take place. And it's like, okay, well, I'm going to develop this land. What are you going to do? And then as a transportation office, we can communicate, hey, here's some options or some things that would be beneficial based on the transportation demand management program, which for Anne Arundel County is commuter connection. Commuter connection is tied to WashCog and BMC, right? It's kind of the state or the region-wide transportation demand management apparatus, if you will. And so, we're saying, hey, the more that we can get businesses or developers to kind of incorporate TDM measures, then essentially that's the overall goal of what the program is supposed to be. Mm-hmm. I guess my question for you is, how do you think that that's an appropriate measure for, and I'm saying development reviews, but I guess it would be more so it's land use, right? It's kind of dictating what's going to happen for land use. Do you think that that's an appropriate measure as I've defined it, or do you think that that should be something different? Or or a better question is, have you seen it that way, where the TDM strategies are associated with the land use and measuring what implementable strategy you can put towards the land use? Because you can't make anybody do it, right? But you can offer it up based on all of the tools in the toolbox. And so you can measure, okay, well, how successful were you basically utilizing these TDM strategies by getting the development or the land, or for that land use to actually be inclusive of the TDM?
Yeah, I'm sure there are, I think there are measures that maybe I can get back to you, but so those, for instance, measures I mentioned, like density, diversity, and so jobs, housing balance, for instance, how your development will impact, influence the jobs, housing balance. Let's say, we encourage mixed use development, right? You can maybe, some measures you can require mix, what kind of mixed development they are proposing, and how that would affect the jobs housing balance. Those are, you can come up, those are quantifiable measures, that you can look at the number of jobs, number of housing, and maybe you can look at the workforce in an area, and look at maybe their travel patterns. These are all, I think, quantifiable. We have done it before. And there are some other sustainability indicators, I think. And also there is this traffic impact studies, right? You require traffic impact studies.
We do.
Yeah, so that will be one, but there is a standard way of doing that, right? And they may be just, applying the standard way, but there is also more kind of elaborate ways of doing this traffic impact studies. For instance, using, instead of traditional, trip generation methods, there are also dynamic traffic analysis tools, right? Or some simulation tools that looks at not only the developed area, but neighboring, intersections. And I think they typically look at just the few intersections around the development and what changes on those roads and so on. Instead, a network perspective, right, could be required. And yeah, I think definitely there are ways to comment, and also there are some I can share with you later on. There are some new approach how to incorporate TDM into travel planning process. Right now, travel planning process does not necessarily include TDM in it.
Okay.
So I saw a couple reports on that I can share with you.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we are out of time. I want to thank Dr. Erdogan for her amazing presentation, and for all the attendees. We will have this webinar online, and hopefully as well as the PowerPoint presentation, and any other material Dr. Erdogan would like to share with us. That would be great. Thanks everyone for coming, and we hope to see you soon. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.